June 12, 1944. The salty air of Normandy's coast mingled with the metallic scent of blood as Lieutenant Nurse Margaret Hastings hunched over a wounded soldier in a makeshift medical tent 6 miles inland from Omaha Beach. Her hands moved with practiced precision, despite having worked for 36 hours straight, inserting the needle into the young man's arm while shells exploded in the distance. She glanced at the bottle of plasma hanging above them, one of the last they had, and silently calculated how many more lives they could save before supplies ran out. What Margaret didn't know was that her frustration with this critical shortage would lead her to discover a revolutionary method of blood preservation that military brass would initially dismiss as completely insane, yet would ultimately save the lives of more than 50,000 American soldiers before the war's end. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how a stubborn army nurse with no formal research training upended medical orthodoxy and transformed battlefield medicine through a combination of desperation, ingenuity, and a willingness to challenge authority when lives were at stake. The deafening thunder of artillery fire punctuated the night as Lieutenant Nurse Margaret Hastings struggled to maintain her footing in the mud-slicked floor of the 1st Auxiliary Surgical Hospital's blood collection station. 6 days had passed since D-Day, and the casualties continued to flood in at a staggering rate. The unit, positioned near St-Lô in Normandy, operated out of a commandeered stone farmhouse with canvas extensions serving as additional treatment areas. The ancient wooden beams above creaked ominously with each distant explosion. "Type O, universal donor, get him processed quickly," called out Captain James Whitfield, the senior medical officer, as 2 orderlies carried in another volunteer soldier, a young private who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. The boy's face was ashen from exhaustion, but he managed a weak smile as Margaret approached. "First time donating, Private?" Margaret asked, preparing the collection equipment. Her blonde hair was tucked neatly under her cap, though after nearly 2 days without proper rest, several strands had escaped to frame her tired face. "Yes, ma'am," the private replied, rolling up his sleeve. "Heard you folks were running low. Figured it's better than sitting in a foxhole waiting for the next barrage." Margaret nodded appreciatively. Every pint saves a life, that's not an exaggeration out here. She worked methodically, inserting the needle and watching as the rich crimson liquid began filling the glass bottle. Nearby, Technical Sergeant Walter Rubin carefully monitored the refrigeration unit, a modified ammunition container that had been converted into a makeshift cooler using ice blocks transported from the coast. The precious blood supplies inside would last only a few days at most, even under ideal conditions. "Lieutenant Hastings," Rubin called out, his voice tense. "We're down to our last 12 units. Resupply's been delayed again, weather over the channel." Margaret bit her lip, glancing at the dozens of wounded men lying on stretchers throughout the facility. 12 units wouldn't get them through the night, let alone until the next supply convoy arrived. "What about the new preservative formula?" she asked, referring to the acid citrate dextrose solution that had extended blood storage from the previous 7 days to around 10 or 11. Captain Whitfield overheard and shook his head grimly. "Even with ACD, we're losing too many units to spoilage during transport. Blood's not making it from the collection centers in England with this heat and the delays." As Margaret finished collecting the private's donation, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. 2 medics rushed in carrying a soldier with a mangled leg, blood pumping from a severed femoral artery. The man's face had the waxy pallor that Margaret had come to recognize all too well. Hypovolemic shock, the result of catastrophic blood loss. "Get 2 units of whole blood ready," barked Captain Whitfield, already moving to clamp the artery. Margaret hurried to the refrigeration unit, her mind racing through calculations. 2 units for this soldier, at least 1 unit each for the 3 severe chest wounds they'd received an hour ago. That would leave them with only 7 units for what could be dozens more casualties before dawn. As she handed the precious blood to the captain, a wild, seemingly impossible idea began forming in her mind. During nursing school at Massachusetts General in Boston, she had spent a summer working with a brilliant but eccentric pathologist named Dr. Eleanor Chatham, who had been experimenting with unconventional methods of tissue preservation. One technique in particular stuck in Margaret's memory, a counterintuitive approach that went against everything in the medical textbooks. Later that night, with the wounded temporarily stabilized, Margaret sat in the cramped supply closet that doubled as her sleeping quarters, scribbling furiously in her notebook by the light of a single bulb. The conventional wisdom was absolute. Blood had to be refrigerated to prevent bacterial growth and cellular breakdown. Even with the newest ACD preservative, whole blood became dangerous to transfuse after about 2 weeks at most. But what if the problem wasn't just about temperature? What if the real issue was oxygen exposure and mechanical stress during transport? Dr. Chatham's experiments had shown that certain biological materials could be preserved through a process she called protective dehydration and rehydration, essentially removing most of the water under controlled conditions, then restoring it later without damaging the cells. The concept seemed preposterous when applied to blood, yet Margaret wondered if a modified version might work. Blood plasma was already being freeze-dried successfully. What if whole blood could be partially concentrated, mixed with the right preservatives, and then reconstituted with sterile saline solution when needed? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find Technical Sergeant Rubin standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Sorry to disturb you, Lieutenant," he said, "but I saw your light on and, well, I think you should know the refrigeration unit is failing. Condenser can't handle the heat and dust. We'll lose everything by morning unless we get parts we don't have." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, then down at her notes. "Maybe we don't need it," she said quietly. "Ma'am?" She stood abruptly, suddenly energized despite her exhaustion. "Get me every bottle of sodium citrate and dextrose solution we have, and find me some clean buckets, the largest you can locate." "Lieutenant, I don't understand." "We're going to try something completely unorthodox, Sergeant. Something that might get me court-martialed." She smiled grimly. "But if it works, we'll save a lot of lives tonight." By dawn, Margaret had set up her experimental station in a corner of the hospital's supply room. Using equipment cobbled together from medical supplies and kitchen items borrowed from a nearby French farmhouse, she had created a rudimentary system for processing blood donations. Captain Whitfield, initially skeptical, had reluctantly given his permission after the refrigeration unit failed completely. "This goes against everything in the manual," he said, watching as Margaret carefully mixed a solution of sodium citrate, dextrose, and a small amount of phosphate buffer in precise measurements. "The manual wasn't written for field hospitals losing half their blood supply to spoilage, sir," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Besides, we have nothing to lose at this point." The process Margaret had devised involved separating the blood components using gentle centrifugation, achieved by having Sergeant Rubin manually spin a modified cream separator borrowed from the farm, then carefully removing a portion of the plasma while leaving the valuable red cells and platelets behind. To this concentrated mixture, she added her preservative solution in precise ratios, then sealed the bottles with paraffin wax to prevent oxygen exposure. "The red cells should remain viable if we keep them from oxidizing," she explained to the increasingly interested Captain Whitfield. "When we need to transfuse, we simply add sterile saline to reconstitute to the proper volume." "And you learned this where exactly?" he asked. "I observed something similar in a research lab at Mass General, but this is an adaptation," she admitted, "based more on theory than proven science." The first test came sooner than expected. Shortly after noon, a jeep arrived carrying 3 severely wounded infantrymen who had been caught in a mortar attack. One soldier had lost so much blood that the medics had been certain he wouldn't survive the journey. "We need blood now," Captain Whitfield called out, his hands already deep in the abdomen of one soldier, searching for the source of bleeding. Margaret's heart raced as she retrieved one of her experimental units. Following her carefully noted protocol, she added the precise amount of sterile saline solution, gently mixed the container to reconstitute the cells, and ran it through a filter to remove any microscopic clots that might have formed. "Captain, experimental unit ready," she announced, bringing the bottle to his side. Whitfield hesitated only briefly, looking from the dying soldier to the unusual-looking blood preparation. "Do it," he said grimly. As the reconstituted blood flowed into the soldier's veins, Margaret held her breath. Within minutes, his pallor began to improve, and the weak pulse at his wrist grew stronger. By the time they had emptied the unit, the man's vital signs had stabilized enough for surgery to proceed. "I'll be damned," whispered Captain Whitfield. "It actually worked." Over the next 2 days, Margaret refined her process, documenting each step meticulously. Word of her unorthodox method spread through the medical units near the front lines, eventually reaching Colonel Howard Maxwell, Chief of Blood Services for the European Theatre. On June 16th, his jeep pulled up outside the hospital. Colonel Maxwell was a tall, imposing man with steel-grey hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He found Margaret in her makeshift laboratory, supervising 2 nurses she had trained in her technique. "Lieutenant Hastings," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I understand you've been experimenting with blood preservation methods without authorization." Margaret straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir. We had an emergency situation with our refrigeration and supply." "Do you realize the potential danger of using unproven methods on wounded men?" he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Blood transfusion protocols exist for a reason, Lieutenant." "With all due respect, sir," Margaret replied steadily, "we've successfully transfused 27 patients with my method, with 0 adverse reactions. The technique has effectively doubled our usable blood supply in field conditions." Colonel Maxwell's expression remained stern. "Show me." For the next hour, Margaret demonstrated her process from collection to reconstitution, explaining each step in detail. She showed the colonel her meticulous records, documenting vital signs before and after transfusion, recovery rates, and the surprising longevity of the preserved units, some now 4 days old and still viable when reconstituted. The partial dehydration and oxygen exclusion seemed to be the key factors, she explained. By removing approximately 30% of the plasma volume and creating an anaerobic environment, we dramatically slow cellular deterioration. Colonel Maxwell inspected one of the reconstituted units, holding it up to the light to examine its color and consistency. "And this works as effectively as fresh whole blood?" "Nearly so," Margaret acknowledged. "We've observed slightly longer clotting times, but overall oxygen-carrying capacity appears unchanged. For patients with significant blood loss, the difference is negligible compared to having no blood available at all." The colonel was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set down the bottle and fixed Margaret with a penetrating gaze. "Lieutenant, what you've done here is either brilliantly innovative or dangerously reckless, possibly both." He paused. "I'm ordering a formal evaluation of your method. If it proves as effective as you claim, we may implement it more widely. In the meantime, you have my provisional authorization to continue, provided you maintain complete records of all procedures and outcomes." 3 weeks later, Margaret's blood preservation technique had spread to 7 field hospitals near the front lines, saving countless lives during the brutal Normandy campaign. The method proved particularly valuable during the chaotic Allied advance, when supply lines were stretched thin and conventional refrigeration was often unavailable. On a sweltering July afternoon, Margaret was supervising a blood collection drive at a forward aid station when she was surprised to see Colonel Maxwell returning, this time accompanied by a distinguished-looking civilian in a rumpled suit. "Lieutenant Hastings," the colonel said, his tone noticeably warmer than during their first meeting. "This is Dr. Charles Drew from the National Research Council's Blood for Britain program." Margaret's eyes widened. Charles Drew was a pioneer in blood banking whose work had revolutionized plasma preservation. His presence here was both an honor and slightly terrifying. "Dr. Drew," she said, extending her hand, "your work on plasma preservation was required reading in my nursing program." Dr. Drew smiled warmly, shaking her hand with firm gentleness. "And now it seems I'm here to learn from you, Lieutenant. Colonel Maxwell has shared your records with me, and I must say your innovation is remarkable, especially considering the conditions under which it was developed." Over the next several hours, Margaret and Dr. Drew discussed her technique in detail. The distinguished physician asked probing questions about every aspect of the process, occasionally suggesting refinements or alternative approaches. "The beauty of your method," Dr. Drew observed as they walked through the aid station, is its simplicity. No complex equipment, minimal refrigeration requirements, and it can be performed by anyone with basic medical training after a short demonstration. Necessity is the mother of invention, Margaret replied. We simply had no other options. Dr. Drew nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the most significant breakthroughs come from exactly such circumstances. He paused, studying her with newfound respect. Lieutenant, with your permission, I'd like to formalize and standardize your protocol for wider implementation. This could save thousands of lives, not just here, but in the Pacific Theater as well. By September 1944, what had become known as the Hastings Method was being taught to medical personnel throughout the European theater of operations. Specially designed kits were produced containing the precise chemicals, equipment, and instructions needed to implement the technique even in the most primitive conditions. As the Allied forces pushed toward Germany, Margaret found herself reassigned to the 108th General Hospital in Paris, where she was tasked with training medical personnel in her blood preservation technique. The elegant hospital, set up in what had been a luxury hotel before the war, was a far cry from the muddy field hospital where she had first developed her method. One evening, as she was completing a training session for a group of newly arrived nurses, an orderly approached with a message. She was wanted in the hospital director's office immediately. With a sense of foreboding, sudden summons rarely brought good news in the army. Margaret made her way through the ornate corridors. Colonel William Barker, the hospital's commanding officer, was waiting with two other men. Colonel Maxwell and a third officer Margaret didn't recognize, a brigadier general whose chest displayed an impressive array of decorations. Lieutenant Hastings, Colonel Barker said formally. Allow me to introduce Brigadier General Robert Williamson from the Surgeon General's office. The general stepped forward, his expression serious. Lieutenant, I've reviewed the comprehensive data on your blood preservation method, and the results are frankly astonishing. Initial reports indicate a 68% reduction in blood unit wastage and a significant improvement in availability at forward medical stations. Margaret stood at attention, uncertain how to respond. Thank you, sir. I'm pleased it's proving useful. Useful? The general's eyebrows rose. Lieutenant, conservative estimates suggest your technique has already saved over 15,000 lives that would otherwise have been lost to blood shortages. That's an entire division's worth of men. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew an official document. I'm here to inform you that you're being awarded the Legion of Merit for your contribution to military medicine. Furthermore, the Surgeon General has authorized full implementation of the Hastings method throughout all theaters of operation. Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her. I'm honored, sir, but I didn't do this for recognition. No one who deserves recognition ever does. Lieutenant, the general replied with a small smile, there's something else. Dr. Charles Drew has recommended you for a position with the Army Medical Research Team being assembled for the final phase of the war and the anticipated occupation period. Your innovative thinking is precisely what's needed as we prepare for the challenges ahead. The following week, Margaret found herself on a military transport plane bound for Washington, D.C., where she would spend 2 months working with top medical researchers to refine and standardize her blood preservation technique before returning to Europe with an expanded role. As the plane droned over the Atlantic, she reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a desperate improvisation in a Normandy field hospital. Her thoughts were interrupted by the young captain seated beside her, a surgeon returning to the States after being wounded at Aachen. I hear you're the blood lady, he said conversationally, the one who figured out how to keep it fresh without refrigeration. Margaret smiled. That's one way of putting it. Well, I owe you a personal thank you, he continued. I was with the 4th Infantry Division during the breakout from St. Lo, took some shrapnel when a Tiger tank got our position, would have bled out if not for your miracle blood, as the medics called it. He extended his hand. Captain David Reynolds, pleased to meet the woman who saved my life. As Margaret shook his hand, the full impact of what she had accomplished began to sink in. Each unit of preserved blood represented not just a medical achievement, but a husband returning to his wife, a father to his children, a son to his parents. The real miracle was the teamwork, and she said modestly, from the donors to the medics to the surgeons, I just found a way to connect them more efficiently. Captain Reynolds shook his head. Don't downplay it. Word spread through the entire front about your technique. Boosted morale like you wouldn't believe, knowing that if you got hit, there'd be blood waiting at the aid station, made a difference in ways you probably never imagined. In Washington, Margaret found herself thrust into a world she had never anticipated entering. The Army Medical Research Laboratory was staffed with brilliant scientists and physicians, many of whom initially viewed the young nurse's innovation with professional skepticism. However, as they worked through the science behind her method, even the most doubtful came to appreciate the elegance of her solution. Dr. Eleanor Chatham, the pathologist whose experimental work had inspired Margaret's technique, was brought in as a consultant. Their reunion was emotional for Margaret, who had always admired the older woman's unconventional thinking. "I knew you were bright, Margaret, but this is extraordinary," Dr. Chatham said during their first meeting in the laboratory. "You've taken a theoretical concept and turned it into a practical application that works reliably in the most challenging conditions imaginable." "I had good teachers," Margaret replied, "and desperate circumstances." Dr. Chatham smiled. "The history of medicine is written by those who refuse to accept limitations when lives are at stake." Together with a team of biochemists and hematologists, they spent weeks refining the formula and processing techniques. The improved version extended the viability of blood units to nearly 3 weeks without refrigeration. An unprecedented achievement that would revolutionize not just military medicine, but civilian blood banking as well. In November, as Margaret prepared to return to Europe with the newly standardized protocols, she was surprised to receive an invitation to the White House. President Roosevelt had taken a personal interest in medical innovations supporting the war effort, and her blood preservation technique had caught his attention. The meeting was brief but profound. The president, despite his visibly failing health, listened intently as Margaret explained her method in layman's terms. "You know, Lieutenant Hastings," Roosevelt said thoughtfully, "throughout this war, I've been continuously amazed by the ingenuity of ordinary Americans placed in extraordinary circumstances." He smiled warmly, "though I suspect you were never quite ordinary to begin with." "Just stubborn, Mr. President," she replied, earning a genuine laugh from Roosevelt. "The best kind of American," he said, "the kind who sees an insurmountable problem and refuses to accept that it cannot be solved." By January 1945, Margaret was back in Europe, now holding the rank of captain and serving as technical advisor to blood supply units supporting the final push into Germany. The improved Hastings method had been fully integrated into the military medical system, with specialized training teams ensuring consistent implementation across all forward medical units. On a bitterly cold morning near the Belgian border, Margaret visited a field hospital supporting troops fighting in the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge. The hospital was set up in an abandoned school building, its classrooms converted into wards and operating theaters. Despite the grim circumstances, she was heartened to see her blood preservation kits being used exactly as designed, ensuring that no wounded soldier went without this life-saving resource. As she observed a nurse training new personnel on the technique, a familiar voice called her name. Turning, she saw Walter Rubin, now a master sergeant, approaching with a broad smile. "Captain Hastings!" he exclaimed, snapping a sharp salute. "Or should I say, the famous blood wizard of Normandy." Margaret laughed, returning his salute before giving him a quick hug. "Sergeant Rubin, what are you doing here?" "Transferred to the 101st Evacuation Hospital last month. We're supporting the 7th Armored." He gestured around the busy hospital. "Never thought I'd see the day when blood supply wouldn't be our biggest worry in a forward station. Remember those first days after D-Day? Running out every 12 hours? How could I forget? You were my first reluctant assistant." Rubin's expression grew serious. "You know, they've been keeping records, statistical analysis and all that. Word is your method has saved over 40,000 lives so far, probably more by now." The number struck Margaret with physical force, momentarily leaving her speechless. 40,000 men who might otherwise have died, enough to populate a small city. "It doesn't seem possible," she finally said. "Believe it," Rubin replied firmly. "And it's not just the direct saves from transfusions. It's changed how we operate overall. Surgeons take on cases they would have considered hopeless before. Medics push forward, knowing they can stabilize severe cases. The whole chain of survival is stronger. As the Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, Margaret found herself increasingly involved in planning for post-war medical infrastructure. The Hastings method had implications far beyond military application. It could revolutionize blood banking in remote civilian hospitals, disaster response, and developing nations where refrigeration was unreliable. On May 7, 1945, Margaret was in a meeting at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force when news of Germany's unconditional surrender was announced. The room erupted in cheers, but Margaret found herself overcome with a complex mixture of emotions: joy, relief, grief for those lost, and uncertainty about what would come next. That evening, as impromptu celebrations erupted throughout Paris, she sat quietly in her quarters, writing in the journal she had maintained since those first desperate days in Normandy. Her detailed notes had expanded from simple technical observations to philosophical reflections on medicine, humanity, and the strange paradox of healing in the midst of a war designed to destroy. "The final casualty figures came in today," she wrote. "Conservative estimates place the number of lives saved by the blood preservation method at over 50,000 American servicemen, with thousands more Allied troops benefiting as well. It seems impossible that something conceived in such desperate circumstances could have such far-reaching impact." She paused, pen hovering over the page, struggling to articulate the profound sense of purpose that had carried her through the darkest days of the war. "Perhaps that is the lesson in all of this," she continued, "that even in our darkest hour, human ingenuity and compassion can create ripples that spread outward in ways we cannot imagine. Every life saved is not just a statistical victory, but a future restored. Decades of potential, families unbroken, dreams unprevented." In the months following Germany's surrender, as the world began the long process of healing, Margaret's contribution to military medicine received formal recognition from medical associations and governments around the world. The Hastings method was adapted for civilian use, with modifications that made it suitable for blood banking in regions with unreliable infrastructure. By late 1945, Margaret had returned to the United States, accepting a position at the newly established National Institutes of Health, where she would continue her research into blood preservation techniques. On her desk sat a simple frame containing a letter from a soldier she had never met, one of thousands who had written to thank her after learning that her innovation had saved their lives. "Dear Lieutenant Hastings," the letter read, "you don't know me, but according to the doctors, your blood storage method is the only reason I'm alive to write this letter. I took shrapnel in the Hurtgen forest and lost so much blood the medics didn't think I'd make it to the aid station. But they had your special blood units, and here I am, back home with my wife and meeting my newborn daughter who arrived while I was overseas. The doctors told me about you and your discovery, and I wanted you to know that because of you, Grace Eleanor Miller has a father. We gave her the middle name Eleanor after learning that was the name of your mentor. Thank you isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer. Eternally grateful, Staff Sergeant James Miller." On a crisp autumn day in 1946, Margaret stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing an international conference on wartime medical innovations. Before her sat hundreds of physicians, researchers, and military medical personnel from around the world, all eager to learn about the breakthrough that had changed the face of combat medicine. The story of the blood preservation technique that many of you now use began not with a flash of brilliance, she told them, but with a simple, desperate need: a broken refrigerator, dwindling supplies, and wounded men who couldn't wait for perfect solutions. She described those early days in Normandy, the trial and error, the support of colleagues who had been willing to take a chance on an unproven method when the alternatives were exhausted. The lesson I hope you take from this is not about the specific technique, which will undoubtedly be improved upon by the brilliant minds in this room. Rather, it's about the power of necessity to drive innovation, and the importance of listening to those on the front lines, not just generals and department heads, but nurses, technicians, and medics who see problems from unique perspectives. As she concluded her address, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from a frightened young nurse wading ashore at Normandy to a recognized pioneer in medical science. In medicine, as in war, victory rarely comes from a single decisive moment. Instead, it emerges from countless small battles won through persistence, creativity, and unwavering commitment to those we serve. The challenges ahead, diseases yet uncured, systems yet unimproved, will not be overcome by solitary geniuses, but by communities of dedicated professionals who refuse to accept that any problem is unsolvable. The standing ovation that followed seemed to Margaret less a personal tribute than a recognition of a larger truth, that human ingenuity, sparked by compassion and driven by necessity, remains our greatest resource in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. In the decades that followed, the principles behind the Hastings method would inform blood banking practices worldwide, evolving with new technologies but retaining the core insight that had begun in that makeshift laboratory in Normandy, that sometimes the most powerful innovations are those that work with limited resources in imperfect conditions. Margaret herself continued her work in medical research, eventually establishing a foundation dedicated to advancing field medicine in underserved regions around the world. The techniques she developed continued saving lives long after the guns of World War II fell silent, in natural disasters, remote villages, and conflict zones where conventional medical infrastructure was unavailable. On the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, an elderly but still vibrant Margaret Hastings returned to Normandy with a group of veterans. Standing on the bluff overlooking the beach where it had all begun, she was approached by an old man walking with the assistance of a cane. "Lieutenant Hastings?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's been a long time since anyone called me Lieutenant," she replied with a smile. "Just Margaret now." The man straightened as much as his aged frame would allow and offered a salute. "Technical Sergeant Walter Rubin, ma'am, though they bumped me to Master Sergeant before discharge." Margaret's eyes widened in recognition. Walter, my goodness, after all these years. They embraced like the old friends they were, survivors of a time that had tested humanity to its limits. "I've been following your work," Rubin said as they walked slowly along the bluff. "The foundation, the research, all of it. But you know what I think about most often? Those first units we processed together, you with your crazy theory and me thinking you'd lost your mind from exhaustion." Margaret laughed. "We were quite a team, weren't we?" "The best kind," he agreed. "The kind that changes the world without even realizing that's what they're doing." As they looked out over the peaceful beach below, now dotted with tourists rather than landing craft, Rubin gestured with his free hand. "They say this was the beginning of the end of the war, this beach, but for a lot of us, it was also the beginning of understanding what humans are really capable of, both the terrible and the magnificent." Margaret nodded, watching the waves gently washing the shore. "I've often thought that's the great paradox of war. It brings out the worst in humanity, yet simultaneously creates conditions that reveal our best qualities: courage, innovation, selflessness." "Your blood technique saved more than 50,000 men," Rubin said. "That's what the final reports concluded. But what they couldn't measure was what those 50,000 went on to do, the children they raised, the work they accomplished, the lives they touched. That ripple effect continues even now, invisible but profound." As the sun began to set over the English Channel, casting long shadows across the landscape that had once been scarred by war, Margaret reflected on the strange path that had led her from disaster to discovery. A failed refrigeration unit, a desperate improvisation, and an idea that conventional wisdom had deemed impossible had combined to create something that transcended its origins. "The most valuable lesson I learned in those days," she told Rubin as they made their way back toward the memorial ceremony, "wasn't about blood preservation at all. It was that the boundary between impossible and not yet attempted is far more permeable than we imagine. Sometimes all it takes to cross that line is the courage to try when failure seems certain." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.